Hi there. My name is Mark Penrith. I am pastor at Benoni Baptist Church. And this week we are talking to 4SA's head of legal, Liesl Pretorius. Liesl, it's always good talking to you. Glad to have you on again. 4SA was recently alerted to an incident where a pharmacist was dismissed after refusing to dispense I hope I get this right, Liesl, misoprostol, which is a drug which is commonly used for abortions based on her religious belief that abortion is morally wrong. And Liesl, I know unpacking this is going to kind of bring out all kinds of ethical questions and a number of philosophical questions and even practical concerns. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So thanks for making time to have it together with us. And maybe to start, please provide us with a little bit of background on this issue. Why is this a freedom of religion issue, a belief issue in our country?
Thank you, Mark. So, Section 15 of the Constitution protects the right to live out one's religious and moral convictions. However, it is not clear whether the pharmacist in question knew the patient intended to use the medication for an abortion or not. Now, misoprostol is used mainly to reduce the risk of gastric ulcers. So, being prescribed for an abortion is an off-label use. A woman can show up with a valid script for misoprostol and it's because she has a gastric ulcer, or a man can show up with a script for it, and it is for a gastric ulcer. So, being prescribed for an abortion, you don't necessarily know if it is being prescribed for an abortion, especially if the woman who's standing there is not visibly pregnant. If the pharmacist did know that the medication was prescribed for an abortion. And of course, then the questions come up of how ethical it is to question a patient who has a valid script, especially if the patient is not visibly pregnant. But if she knew it was to be used for an abortion, then a refusal was based on conscience and it engages her constitutional right to religious freedom. If she did not know why the doctor gave the script for misoprostol to this patient, in other words, why this medication is being prescribed, her refusal may fall outside the scope of religious freedom protections, and then it becomes a professional conduct issue. However, because pharmacists are not currently granted the same right to conscientious objection as other healthcare professionals, for example, doctors and nurses, for example, this still raises a serious concern about the unequal protection of religious and conscious rights under South African law. 4SA has written to the South African Pharmacy Council. We have requested their views on this matter because when something like this happens, we would like first to engage parties, hear their views, get the facts, etc. And we are waiting to hear from them. But on the face of it, it seems that this may be a freedom of religion and belief issue, especially because the pharmacist said that her refusal to dispense the misoprostol was not based on clinical, legal, or professional reasons, but based on her deeply held religious conviction, specifically her religious belief that abortion is a murder or equivalent to murder. And in South African law, as I said, Section 15 of the Constitution, the right to freedom of religion, it protects everyone's freedom of conscience, religion, thought, belief, and opinion. And this protection isn't limited to your internal belief. It also includes being able to live out your belief, to express your belief, and act on those beliefs within reasonable bounds. And that's why it becomes a constitutional rights issue when someone is compelled by law or policy to act in a way that fundamentally violates their conscience or their religious beliefs, particularly under a serious threat, for example, like dismissal, what happened in this instance, or even imprisonment.
No, even as you're talking, I'm remembering previous conversations that we've had, many conversations that we've had, where it comes down to you don't stop being a Christian when you leave your home, when you walk out your door. You take your religious belief with you, and you have a constitutional right to that. And I'm reminded that you get to be a Christian even at your workplace, whether you're a pastor or a computer scientist or a pharmacist. But what does the law actually say about pharmacists right now and the ability to refuse or dispense medication like this medication? And maybe also, just in terms of that conversation that you had regarding the classification of pharmacists as other healthcare professionals, why is that so problematic in your view?
Well, currently, the National Clinical Guideline for the Implementation on the Choice of Termination of Pregnancy Act only allows so-called direct termination of pregnancy providers, and this includes doctors and nurses, to conscientiously object, provided they refer the patient to someone who is willing to assist her. Pharmacists are not considered direct providers under this guideline, and therefore they are compelled to dispense abortive medication or face sanctions. And these sanctions can include fines or imprisonment even. So the classification is problematic, not classifying pharmacists as direct providers. We don't know whether at the time when the guidelines were written, there weren't, abortive medication was not available through pharmacies and could only be done at a doctor's practice, at a clinic, at a hospital, because it would seem very logical if the pharmacist dispenses that medication. In my view, and I'm not a medical professional, it seems like there's a direct involvement. They are directly providing that. So I can understand why a pharmacist who is a person of faith, based on their religious beliefs, or a person based on some other belief that impacts their conscience, would not want to do that because they would feel that they are directly involved in something that they object to. So this classification is problematic, very problematic, especially in early medical abortions up to 12 weeks of gestations, because it seems that in this instance, in pharmacists, they are often directly involved in providing a medication then that terminates the pregnancy. And like I said, in that case, they do function practically as direct providers, and excluding them from this right to refuse and refer, creates discrimination, unfair discrimination, because there's no rational basis to, in that instance, distinguish between them and doctors and nurses, it seems, because they have a substantive role in that process.
Just talking of their role then, isn't there a risk that by allowing refusal to pharmacists, you might deny patients access to critical healthcare services?
Well, we believe that the risk is mitigated if a refuse and refer model is followed, as is the case for doctors and nurses under current guidelines, those guidelines. And if you look at the code of conduct or the guidelines for the Health Professions Council, which applies to doctors and nurses, pharmacists fall under the Pharmacy Council. Patients are not denied access if a healthcare provider refuses and refers. They are simply redirected to another provider who does not have a conscientious objection. And this is a reasonable accommodation that respects and balances both sets of constitutional rights. Reasonable accommodation is a very important constitutional and South African law because in a society such as ours, where you have different rights, reasonable accommodation tries to balance those rights against each other so that the rights of all parties involved are maximized and not necessarily unnecessarily limited.
So, if I've understood you correctly, there's two rights at play here: the right to the freedom of religion, and the right of a patient to access healthcare. How does the Constitution give guidance in terms of balancing those rights? How do those rights exist in tension with one another?
So the Constitution has a section 36, which is called the Limitations Clause, and it allows for rights to be limited because the rights in the Bill of Rights are not absolute. All rights can be limited, but they can be limited subject to certain conditions. For example, they can be limited only if it is reasonable and justifiable. So the current absolute requirement on pharmacists that they have to dispense this abortion, they cannot refuse and refer. They will face sanctions and repercussions if they refuse to dispense this medication, this abortive medication. That is not the least restrictive means of achieving patient access, because you have to remember that the Choice on Termination of Pregnancy Act gives certain rights to patients who want to access an abortion. And depending on your religious beliefs and your moral convictions, you might not agree with that, but that is what the law says at the moment. So how do we balance the existing rights that are in our law at the moment? A refuse to refer policy is what the Health Profession Council has. And it's also in the clinical guidelines. This is doctors and nurses that can appeal to that. They can use that. It works for them as practitioners. It is a less restrictive means. It protects the religious freedom right of the practitioner involved, and it does not restrict the access to abortion that that patient wants. So it's a proportionate way to balance rights when you look at it from a legal point of view. So that is one way one constitutional way with the framework that we have at the moment, that those rights can be balanced, and that the right to freedom of religion of healthcare practitioners, including pharmacists, can be protected.
Okay, but that's great if you're a nurse or if you're a doctor. Right now, pharmacists don't fall into that. So what's the way forward for them? What would 4SA recommend in their case?
Well, we would recommend that the guidelines be amended to recognize that pharmacists are direct providers in cases of early medical abortion, and that this right is extended to them as well. So they can also refuse and refer, so that they can also be protected, just like other healthcare professionals who are direct providers. And we also support the pharmacist in this case appealing a dismissal. And like I said, we would still want some more facts of this case, but on the face of it, it seems like this is a freedom of religion issue, and that you should appeal his dismissal, because being dismissed based on your conscience rights and not being given an option, another option, so for example, refer and refuse or something like that. Like I said, we still need to get to the facts, but this is something that the protection that she should have at the very least. If, like I said, if she did not know what the drug was intended to be used for, then it's perhaps not a freedom of religion issue, perhaps one related to ethics, for example.
Yeah, look, I mean, just 2 cents as I'm listening in. When I go to a pharmacist, I'm going to a professional that I know has studied for, 5 years for the degree and has done a year of community service and other professional body examinations. I kind of expect them to have the freedom to ask the kinds of questions they need in order to make sure that the drugs I'm putting in my body are right. So I would imagine that pharmacists should have at least the ethical responsibility to ask questions and the freedom to ask questions of the patients that they're attending to. I even remember a few years ago this coming up in the media and surcharges being placed onto interactions that pharmacists were having with patients, recognizing that they did have these. All of this is just coming to mind. I imagine that this is going to work out over the next while, and that this will be news that we follow in the media. But before our conversation started, Liesl, you and I were just talking about how this relates in some ways, even to pastors and to marriage officers conducting weddings, and that whole concept of right of refusal. Maybe you want to just key the listeners into that conversation as well, because it really was fascinating.
Yes, so this issue faced by pharmacists, it's very similar to that faced by state-employed marriage officers who are compelled to solemnize all legal marriages, in other words, all marriages recognized by South African law, even those, even though that particular marriage or union is in conflict with their religious views on what a marriage is. In both cases, they are required to perform their core job functions, even though it might directly violate their conscience. Now, when it comes to the conclusion of marriages, 4SA has argued that a distinction must be made between formalization of a marriage, which is the administrative act, ensuring that all the legal requirements are met. Is there consent? Do you have witnesses? Are the parties of marrying age? And solemnization. So you have formalization on the one side, and you have solemnization on the other side. Solemnization is more ceremonial. It can carry religious or moral meaning. And we propose that as civil marriage officers, this is a state-employed marriage officer, it can be somebody who works for the Department of Home Affairs, a magistrate. They are only involved in formalizing marriages, because you could see that is an inherent element, or inherent requirement of their job. If you are a marriage officer employed by Department of Home Affairs, you have to be able to at least formalize a marriage in order to do that job. And similar to the pharmacist context, we argue that if providing any healthcare is an inherent duty, then that obligation can still be referred through a refuse and refer policy. Just as marriage officers can uphold the law without violating their beliefs, so too can pharmacists if the law allows for reasonable accommodation. But this is the issue, that the reason that right to conscientious objection of the civil marriage officers was taken away when the Civil Union Act was amended. And now we have a new marriage bill before Parliament. And there's a robust protection for religious marriage officers, but not for civil marriage officers. And we say There's a reasonable accommodation, that the state can fulfill its duty to provide marriage services to all who can legally marry on an equal basis, no unfair discrimination, fulfill, its legal obligations, but also protect the right of the freedom of religion of its employees. Like as you said, we don't leave our religion at home and our freedom of religion at home when we leave for work in the morning. But both situations, it does call for a nuanced balancing of rights, under Section 36, the limitations clause of the Constitution, ensuring that, one person's rights are not unduly sacrificed to uphold the rights of another.
Hmm. Even as we come to the end of our conversation, I imagine that some folks' interest will be piqued and they would want more information. I'd like to refer them to the 4SA webpage. That's www.4sa.org.za. And there you can get documents, you can get news articles, you can watch videos. There's plenty of media and information on the website. You can also go to the socials, both Facebook and YouTube. 4SA is active there. And don't forget to sign up for the newsletter on the 4SA website. Liesl, as always, it's really interesting chatting to you. Thank you so much for making the time. You've certainly opened up a whole lot of questions around ethics and around both abortion as well as marriage. A lot to think about. Thanks for the interaction.
Thank you, Mark. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Cool. God bless.